Hi, everybody. Today we're doing a very special show with writer Kirk Ellis. We're going to be talking about the life and films of Billy Wilder. This is a two-part show, and in the first one, we'll talk about a lot of his early works, and in the second part of the show, we'll focus, or the second episode of the show, we'll focus on Ace in the Hole.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be back. I'm always amazed you keep inviting me. I thought you and Gary and Lizette would be tired of me by now, or if not you, certainly your viewers, but always happy to talk about somebody as epic as Wilder.
Yeah, I think the John Adams show was a ton of fun, and I still think Silent Film and Murder was one of the best shows we've done. And so Gary did a piece about the location for Ace in the Hole that aired several weeks ago. So I think this is going to be a great one.
Right.
So I think we could just kick it off by talking about his early life. He was born in Austria.
Right. That's correct. And had that Austrian accent until the day he died, very thick. We can talk about that a little bit about how he learned English and always relied on other writers to help him with the local vernacular as it changed over the decades in America. But he was Austrian born and he cut his teeth as a writer, as a journalist. But there's a new book out now called Billy Wilder on Assignment, which is the first collection in English of some of the great pieces he wrote for a number of German tabloids in Berlin in the Weimar era. And they're really revelatory. And you can see that even as a young man in his late teens and early 20s, he had that acerbic, cynical sort of approach to humanity and the world around him. What people may forget is that Wilder lived a number of lives before he became a Hollywood writer and director. He was at one point, in fact, what was called then a taxi dancer, which is a highfalutin term for a gigolo. He would dress up in tux and tails, and you would dance with middle-aged single women, sometimes married women, who wanted to just be dancing with a young man for a while. And it was an account of that life that got published in a German paper that led to his very extensive journalistic career in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s.
Yeah, out of Berlin, he had quite the time in his early day before as the rise of the Nazi Party got worse, he moved on to Paris.
Right. Well, what was interesting is that he had a break, which is that a forgotten band now, but one of the leading proponents of jazz, Paul Whiteman, great name for a jazz musician, and he was in fact a very large, mustachioed white man. But Paul Whiteman and his orchestra came to Germany on tour in the mid to late 20s, and Wilder sort of attached himself to them, and he went on tour with them for a while. And I think at one point even played in the band for a little while and wrote a whole piece about that. But he was drawn to film. He played a journalist as an extra in a German film around this time. But his entree into film was really with a 1929 film he did called Menschen am Sonntag, which is People on Sunday, which was a collaborative effort with a number of like-minded friends, including Robert Siodmak, who will also immigrate to America in the wake of the rise of Nazism, and Fred Zinnemann, famous as the director of High Noon and A Man for All Seasons, among other great films. They all got together and they put together a cast of non-professional actors and did a structured and scripted but very improvisatory looking film about young people and what they do on their day off. And it's still a remarkable film to watch because it shows what Germany, particularly Berlin, looked like in this period of the late Weimar Republic. It's a really terrific cultural document. And he would go on to write scripts. There's a Disney remake of a film he wrote called Emil and the Detectives, but he wrote the original German version of that. But when he saw the proverbial writing on the wall with the rise of Hitler and the fascists, he fled to France and he wrote and directed. People forget that there was a directorial career for Wilder before America. He directed one film in France before finally coming to America through Mexico to get himself into Hollywood. And as is known, he got out right on the verge because he lost his entire family, his mother, his grandmother, and his stepfather to the Holocaust. The story that he knew for a long time is they all died at Auschwitz. But when he finally went back to Germany after the war to make A Foreign Affair, a wonderful post-war comedy of all things about Berlin, when it was divided up between the Americans, the British, and the Russians, he discovered they had all died in different camps. But that was clearly something that influenced his particularly misanthropic view of humanity in the world.
Yeah, which we see a lot of, and which you will later talk about in terms of Ace in the Hole.
Right, but his initial forays into Hollywood screenwriting were all in light comedies. Essentially, we know the story of Ninotchka. He was working on an Ernst Lubitsch film, and Wilder always worked as a team. There was a team of writers, and there were three of them on Ninotchka. He was one of them, and that was the film that was famous for its tagline, Garbo Smiles. Still a wonderful comedy about sort of the Cold War with the Russians. Remarkable comedy that's on the list of the 100 best comedies ever made. But he also does what I think is an even better picture with Charles Brackett, who becomes his first major collaborator in the early 1940s. And that's a movie called Ball of Fire with Gary Cooper and Barbara Stanwyck. And it's essentially, as Wilder said, a remake with live characters of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In this case, Snow White is a red-hot nightclub singer on the lam from the mob who takes refuge with a group of 7 musty academics, including Gary Cooper, and shows them a new way of living and introduces them to love. It's really a wonderful, wonderful film. And it was on the basis of movies like this that Wilder said he didn't want to spend his life trapped behind a typewriter, which is sort of where I am at this point. He wanted to direct, and he convinced the powers that be at Paramount to give him an opportunity. And he made his American directing debut with a movie called The Major and the Minor with Ginger Rogers and Ray Milland, which is probably most famous for one of Wilder and Brackett's all-time great lines. Why don't you slip out of that wet coat into a dry martini, which got him an Oscar nomination for Best Screenplay. It's only later that Wilder's scripts turned a little bit darker.
Well, and then he went on to cast Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity. Is that right?
That's right. So he does Major and the Minor with Ray Milland, who he will cast in an Oscar-winning performance in The Lost Weekend, the first major Hollywood film, certainly, to deal with alcoholism. And then Barbara Stanwyck will, of course, be cast as the femme fatale of what is really, I guess now Alan Rode and Eddie Muller and the Turner Classic Movies people might debate this, but Double Indemnity is really the first true film noir, based on the James M. Cain book, and I believe co-written with Raymond Chandler, actually. So it's a remarkable turn in performance for Stanwyck. He
really seems to take to Fred McMurray too, and
as well. Yeah. And by the way, that's separate note here. For me, McMurray was always better as a villain, whether he was in a noir or a Western. I never bought him much as a milquetoast character, son of Flubber, all those Disney characters he portrayed. But Wilder was unique in seeing people for what they hadn't done. So here's McMurray as this sort of willing patsy to a murder scheme. And then, of course, later on, he'll be the boss who uses his employee, Jack Lemon's apartment, for purposes of illicit rendezvous with Shirley MacLaine. He's a dastardly character in all these films, and he was never better than when he was in Wilder pictures.
Well, and I read that he said after The Apartment, he'd never play a character like that again. I guess he was so convincing that people in his real life gave him a hard time.
What's interesting about what happens with the collaboration between Wilder and Brackett, this is one of the great sort of director-writer and director-co-writer collaborations in Hollywood history. They do Midnight, they do Bluebeard's Eighth Wife, they do The Lost Weekend and win the Oscar for it. But it comes to Double Indemnity, and Brackett, who's older, remember Wilder's only about 23, 24 when he first comes to Hollywood, so he's still under 30 when he's making his bones and winning all this acclaim. And Brackett is this older writer who knows the ropes, knows the language better certainly than Wilder does. And when it comes to doing Double Indemnity, they split company briefly because Brackett just thought those characters were just despicable, and he didn't want to have anything to do with them. They will come together one last time on Sunset Boulevard, and at that point, their relationship is over. Recently, an academic press published Charles Brackett's diary of this period, and it was really a great book for writers to read who want to learn about the collaborative process, because it's a real love-hate relationship. There are times when he literally dreams and recounts in great detail his painstaking killing of Billy Wilder in a dream. And then he has to go to work with him the next day. But after Sunset Boulevard, he was done. And Wilder had to look for another accomplice, and he found a much better meld for his sensibility a few years later with I.A.L. Diamond, who would go on to write and win the Oscar for The Apartment with him in a whole host of classic Wilder films like Some Like It Hot and The Fortune Cookie and well beyond those films. So Wilder was tough on writers. Norman Krasna, who was a comedy writer, worked with him very, very briefly. Wilder's thing was he was in perpetual motion. He would be in the writer's room, and Wilder would pace and pace and pace, and what if this and what if that and what if that, and they would spitball ideas. And if you weren't on Wilder's level, he could be very cruel in shooting down ideas. And a lot of writers just simply couldn't take it. And it was a matter of him really sifting through collaborators until he found people with whom he shared a similar worldview. Not that many, as you can imagine.
And he had this. Oh, Gary, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, he had that interesting relationship with Marilyn Monroe, with the 7-Year Itch, and then Some Like It Hot. And 7-Year Itch has that scene where the air comes from the grate under her and blows up her dress. And then at some point he finds Jack Lemmon, who is a match made in heaven, apparently.
Right. Well, they do. I think he does more films with Lemmon than any other actor. In fact, I don't think Lemmon does as many films with any other director. So there was clearly a bond between those two. I think Wilder often used Lemmon as his own alter ego in films. It's interesting you mentioned the Monroe thing. There's a urban legend about how Wilder hated Monroe. He may have hated working with her, but he certainly didn't hate her as an actress. He would say a couple of things. He had a couple of standard party lines. One is that, look, I didn't have a problem with Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe had a problem with Marilyn Monroe. And the other one was, she was late to the set. She didn't know her lines. She kept people waiting. She alienated people. And he said, look, I have an aunt. My aunt is always on time. She's always prepared. Everybody loves my aunt. Nobody wants to see a movie with my aunt in it. That's the difference between stars and ordinary people. But there's a larger discussion you can have about Wilder and his approach to women. Now, directors and people in film say things flippantly a lot. And Wilder was often quoted as saying, look, when it comes to writing women and thinking about women characters, if she's not a whore, she's a bore. And it was only in later life that he mellowed to women. And that had a lot to do with his second marriage to his bride, Audrey, I think, who's a former singer and taught him a lot about sensitivity and things like that. You look at this poster behind me, which is the French poster for Ace in the Hole. And this is a famous scene from the film where Kirk Douglas is, let's put it in quotation marks, playfully strangling Jan Sterling with a pair of her own pantyhose. That's a typical Wilder image from the 1940s and the 1950s. The women in the films he directed, as opposed to the earlier films that he was merely the screenwriter on, tend to be pretty hard as nails women who have been around the block a few times. You have to get past the fortune cookie into these sort of late life films like the Private Life of Sherlock Holmes and Avanti and Fedora to see a very different approach to the female characters. But all of that said, Monroe was never better than she was in Some Like It Hot. And Wilder was at the top of his game there. If there's the better comedy from the second half of the 20th century, I haven't seen it. And I should note that the other great 20th century comedy is a wonderful pre-code film from Paramount, directed by Ernst Lubitsch, called Trouble in Paradise. And Wilder gave full credit for everything he did as a director and writer to Lubitsch. And he would say to his collaborators, what would Lubitsch do in this scene? How would Lubitsch make this scene interesting? It was something he always asked. And no matter what height Billy Wilder achieved, and they were great heights in his career, he felt he had never touched Lubitsch as a filmmaker.
So yeah, he and Lemon just adored each other, and I think there was a quote by Wilder saying, you know, heaven was hanging out with Jack Lemmon or something like that. And so right around it's 1950 that he does Sunset Boulevard,
Right.
and you know, he's directed all these amazing women, but none of them into an Oscar role. Shirley MacLaine and
That's right.
Audrey Hepburn.
Gloria Swanson, Barbara Stanwyck, you know, all those women. That says less about Wilder than it does about the voters at the Motion Picture Academy of Arts and Sciences. So, which is still a question today about how so many people would deliver these great performances and they weren't noticed. But it's amazing how many stars he directed in parts that were not their comfort zones. He got them to step outside their image, their shells, and that led them to greater challenges in their films after Wilder. All of them, really. It's a quite remarkable. Actors loved him, and they did multiple films with him. There's a great story about William Holden. William Holden was grousing the whole time he's doing Stalag 17. He's like, Billy, at least give me a speech about the Nazis to show that I'm a nice guy. And, you know, Wilder wasn't having any of that. It's, you know, he wanted this character to be a scoundrel among scoundrels in this prison camp. And he kept saying to Holden, just wait and see how it all comes out. And so Holden would do his part, and he was a professional and did the best job he could. And then he'd go off and have a cigarette and a drink and just bitch and moan about, you know, he's not getting what he wants. And of course, he wins the Oscar for the part. And at the celebration afterwards, he lifts a glass to Billy Wilder and says, to Billy Wilder, of course, I knew this was going to happen all along. So even the hardest actor could be persuaded to do things that they weren't comfortable with. There's a line that goes, at one point, I don't believe it, he was ever offered it, but Wilder liked to tell a story about how he was offered The Sound of Music to direct. And he said, sure, I'll make it about the Nazis. And that was the end of that deal. Again, one of those Hollywood apocryphal stories the directors love to tell about themselves.
He also said, I always shoot a scene out of focus because I want to win a foreign film award. And he did.
Yeah, there was. There's a line from his penultimate film, which is very little seen, although it's come out on DVD recently and Blu-ray, called Fedora, with William Holden and Marta Keller, shot in Greece. That's really, really lovely. But at one point, the Holden character, who is very much a mouthpiece for Billy Wilder, says, talking about he's a producer trying to get this retired actress, very much a Gloria Swanson type, back into a film, and he bemoans the kids with beards and 16 millimeter movie cameras who are shooting everything shaky and out of focus. And clearly he's referring to Martin Scorsese, because this is 3 years after Mean Streets and Taxi Driver. So it's he rebelled against that. But when you look at Wilder's films in comparison to what even his colleagues were making, say in late 40s and 50s, they're still pretty forward looking. But like so many directors of that generation, he found the times moving on, and he could joke about it all he wanted to, with statements like, look, they say, I'm not part of the times, but who the hell wants to make a movie about the times we live in now? But there was clearly resentment and frustration that he couldn't get other projects off the ground.
So did Sunset Boulevard and the success of it change everything, or was that a really pivotal moment? What a hit that is, even compared to the hits of the late 40s?
Well, I think it's a change in his level of power, and also who he's collaborating with. Louis B. Mayer hated. Now the film's made for Paramount, but Louis B. Mayer saw MGM and he wanted to deport Billy Wilder. He goes, how can this man bite the hand that feeds him? How can he toss all of this grime and grit and contempt in our faces when we welcomed him all these years ago when he had nowhere to go? But then, of course, Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett go on to win the Oscar for that screenplay. It's one of the 6 Oscars that Billy Wilder wins. So the difference is that, you can look at Lost Weekend, Double Indemnity, Sunset Boulevard as really, really edgy films for their period. But certainly after Sunset Boulevard, Wilder gives free rein to his cynicism and misanthropy, but he has the power to do so because he is an above the title director, like Alfred Hitchcock. People know Billy Wilder, they know Alfred Hitchcock, they know Howard Hawks, John Ford. He's very elite company, and he's making boatloads of money for the studio. So he has this opportunity to do things his own way, which he really sort of consistently does, for good or ill, for the rest of his career. He's beholden to nobody. And there are great successes, like Some Like It Hot and The Apartment, and there are misfires that simply never should have been made. These happen later on in life. I mean, his last film, unfortunately, was Buddy Buddy, which was a remake of a fairly ordinary French buddy comedy that turns into a terrible lemon meth out vehicle. And even Wilder said about it later, look, I know that when I go to whatever is beyond this, I'm going to be visited by the ghosts of all my past pictures. And I'm going to make sure always to be gone when the ghost of Buddy Buddy comes to pay a visit. So he knew when he screwed up. But I don't think he ever had to compromise his own integrity too much to make the films, whether or not those films should have been made.
It was his journalistic nature, though, that really fueled much of his work when he had an opportunity to exploit.
Right. Well, in one day in Berlin as a cub reporter, he interviews, I think, Richard Strauss and Sigmund Freud the same day. Can you imagine that? What that's like? How intense those conversations are? So at a very early age, he was exposed to the complexity of human existence, and certainly seeing how Germany was transformed, and then what was happening in America, certainly with the blacklist, and that was, of course, something he never suffered from. He was never considered a communist, and he was very cynical about the Hollywood 10. He said there were only 2 of them had talent, the rest were just unpleasant. Whether that was cynical or whether he believed that or not, that was very much part and parcel of who he was. There was never any overt politics in his movies. He despaired of films in the 70s that wore their heart conservative or liberal on their cinematic sleeves. It was something he just felt was not good writing, that all that stuff had to be buried in the character and the story. So, I don't think Billy Wilder, and certainly having read these dispatches from Berlin that have been published, I think as a young man, he took a very jaundiced view of people. And that certainly is true of even the lesser comedies that he wrote before he became a director. What makes them unique is they're not Hollywood, they're not saccharine. And this is a guy who's working within the Hollywood system his entire career. I mean, he comes to America, he starts working at Paramount, he stays at Paramount for almost his entire career. And he's constantly subverting what Hollywood is doing in terms of image making.
He's our guy.
That's why the films hold up. You can look at a lot of John Ford and go, well, it's pictorially elegant, but man, this is really dated. It's really 40s, it's really 50s, or it was never good at the time, but he got away with it because of who he was. And so much of, I think one of my, constant disappointments is revisiting films that I liked 20 or 30 years ago, and I look at them now and go, oh my God, they're actually not that good. I'm not sure they were good then. But Wilder's films, you don't generally have that reaction with. You can object to certain things in them. You can object to the level of misanthropy. You can object to the level of misogyny in movies like The 7-Year Itch, or especially Kiss Me Stupid with Dean Martin. And you can go, wow, that's beyond the pale. But you're never not interested. You're never bored. You're never not stimulated by something that's going on. And for a writer whose work depended on things like voiceover and constant barrages of dialogue, Wilder did have a very good cinematic eye, as good as Ford's, as good as Anthony Mann's, as good as any of those directors working in these more pictorial genres. And he was also one of those directors because he was trained, his first film, Major and the Minor, there was an editor at Paramount who was legendary then named Doane Harrison. And he brought Harrison to the set every day to sort of keep him on track. And Harrison stayed with him as a cutter all the way through The Fortune Cookie. So it's like he stays with him for 20 years as part of the team. And Wilder cut in camera. Now, that isn't to say that he wouldn't do full takes of scenes, but he didn't shoot a lot of coverage. He liked to say, when I'm done cutting the picture, the only thing on the cutting room floor are chewing gum wrappers and tears. And So he was in a very rare breed of people who knew what he was doing when he was on the floor. And he got better at it, as he got more practiced. And you can see that in the films. There's not a lot of coverage. You're not waiting for the standard establishing shot, two shot, over the shoulders, close-ups. That doesn't really occur a lot in Wilder films.
So we're going to largely skip over Ace in the Hole today, but we'll be back next week to talk in depth about the 1951 film. Perhaps we should talk a bit about The Apartment. It was the first director to win Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Original Screenplay at the Oscars.
He picks up 3 Oscars the same night as producer of The Apartment, as director of The Apartment, and as co-writer of The Apartment with I.L. Diamond, or Is Diamond, his collaborator at that time. That's a feat that very few people have matched. The most recent one was, of course, the director of Parasite. Did it 2 seasons ago at the Oscars. Bong Joon-ho repeated the Billy Wilder victory. So, and The Apartment was a groundbreaking film. I mean, The Apartment I like to think of The Apartment as a 70s movie that was made in the 60s, because it really the production code was crumbling then, but it was still in force. There were words you couldn't use, there were situations you couldn't show, but Wilder really pushed the envelope with that film. And all those characters are so complex and so flawed. And Jack Lemmon's character is not heroic. Jack Lemmon's character's got no backbone up until the very end of the picture. And Shirley MacLaine's character knows exactly what she's getting into. And Fred MacMurray, as you said, Jacques, earlier in this conversation, had a lot of guilt about playing the part, but certainly when he's playing the part, that character has no scruples. And I like to direct people to these late life movies of Wilder's that don't get nearly enough exposure. Recently, the TCM Virtual Film Festival, which was again virtual this year because of COVID, showed The Fortune Cookie, which I had not seen since I was a kid practically. And I remembered that film as fall on the floor funny. Well, it still is in places, but it is acerbic to a degree that it's like Ace in the Hole on steroids. It's really a dark view of certainly the legal profession. This was the first Wilder film in which Walter Matthau appeared, and Matthau wins a supporting actor Oscar for his part as the brother-in-law who's a shyster lawyer. And it is breathtakingly bold in how dark it can become and still get laughs at the expense of just about everybody. But then later on, as Wilder's career is sort of in the twilight, and he's doing, terrible remakes of The Front Page and Buddy Buddy, he's also doing these deeply personal films that he makes in Europe. And there are 2 of them that are really worth revisiting. The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which is a gentle compilation of 3 Sherlock Holmes stories that was badly butchered by the studio on its initial release, that took out all the romance and all of the gentility and kept in the sort of plot and the pace and the murders and all of that. Is still wonderful. And its last story, which involves the real story of the Loch Ness Monster, is still terrific. And it's, I'm trying to remember, it's Robert Stevens as Holmes and Colin Blakely as Watson. And then this penultimate film, Fedora, with William Holden as a down on his luck producer trying to restart his career by trying to convince a beyond over the hill actress to return to the screen, is a wonderful film about movie making. I'd rank it up there with Day for Night and The Bad and the Beautiful, films about the industry. That's really Wilder at his most direct and his most romantic.
Is that the one with Gloria Swanson?
No, he tried to get Swanson in the film. She was still around and she refused. Even for you, Billy, I'm not coming out. So a fellow emigre actress, Hildegard Neff, does the part. with Marta Keller as her younger version, as a younger woman who is going to take this part on and play this older woman in the film. And there's a duality to these two characters that Wilder exploits to wonderful cinematic effect in this.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. This was The Life and Films of Billy Wilder, Part 1 with Kirk Ellis. And we'll be back next week to do a deep dive on Ace in the Hole. And thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week for more talk about Billy Wilder with writer Kirk Ellis.